Oh, we're ready to go. Okay, good. So thanks everybody for I guess showing up, for making it out to our talk. Can you all hear me? Is that okay if we go without mics?
Yep.
Okay. It is my pleasure to first of all thank Joshua and Karen for putting this event together, for screening these movies, and then obviously for inviting us to give this talk. And us is Professor Markus Kienchef and myself, Martin Lüthe. We're both assistant professors at the John F. Kennedy Institute for North American Studies at the Freie Universität Berlin. Not that that matters. He's a sociologist and I'm a cultural studies person. And the reason why we're here is because Karin actually and a few other folks that I see in the crowd attended a class of ours that we co-taught last semester at the Institute, and it was called, remind me, Drugs in
US Society and Culture.
That's the one, right? And so the two of us taught it together, and we thus claim a little bit of an expertise, at least in I guess drug-related issues. No questions asked. And Mark,
no answers given.
and Marcus actually more than myself has worked questions of drug and drug policing specifically in the United States, which brings us to what we have planned for you today. There will obviously be a clip, there will be some images because it's about movies and films, but we will start you off with a part that's, I guess, more global, and we entitled it Drugs, Autonomy, and the Social, and it's going to be a brief history of that intersection, I guess, or interconnection between drugs, autonomy, and the social world. So this is, at this stage, mostly about, out of movies experience, the real world, I guess. And then we'll use a clip from a movie that you're probably all familiar with, Trainspotting, as a segue into making these, I guess, fields and issues and themes applicable to the field of movies. And I will briefly talk, and just very briefly, it won't be an in-depth, another lengthy talk about some of the movies in which drugs emerge. Specifically through this notion of abjection, I will tell you what it is, and a genre, and I assume you know what that is. And that's it. And this brings us to part one of this. Okay. We'd like to start off, basically, that's my cue, handing it over, with, a kind of a seemingly evident question, and that is, why drugs are considered harmful and why they are criminalized, or rather the latter, why are they criminalized?
Mm-hmm. And some drugs in particular, why are some drugs criminalized as opposed to others? And of course there's an obvious answer to that, and that's the answer that's the boilerplate answer, as it were, because they're dangerous. So drugs cause harm to people and to the people around the people who do drugs. And some drugs, supposedly, more so than others. However, it's not really that simple. Criminologists often differentiate between harm on the one hand and crime on the other. So, many harmful activities are not crimes, and perhaps some crimes are not really that harmful. So, for instance, polluting the environment causes a lot of harm, but not every form of pollution is illegal. On the other hand, recreational drug use, arguably, or some forms of recreational drug use, are not really that harmful, but they're nonetheless illegal. So, what then makes drugs harmful, and some drugs more harmful than others? And of course there's a kind of common assumption that the danger of any given drug lies in the drug itself, in the substance. Especially in its pharmacological properties. That is to say, in how any given substance affects physiological and biochemical processes in the human body. But this is a fairly reductionist view on drugs and the risks associated with particular drugs. Well, there's no denying that some drugs have more of an effect than others, some drugs are more potent than others, perhaps even more addictive than others. Yet, numerous studies have shown that the potential risk of any given drug cannot be reduced to its pharmacological properties. So what's probably far more important is who does the drug and under what circumstances. That's the old idea of set and setting. Yet this is just an aside to illustrate that the whole debate about the dangerousness of particular drugs is not really as straightforward as it seems. And you're probably well aware that every decade has its demon drug. Now we live in the decade of crystal meth, where crystal meth is the demon drug of choice. Interestingly enough, a lot of the images that are shown to illustrate the dangerousness of crystal are pretty old, and just kind of recycled images from the kind of days when heroin was considered the demon drug of choice and so on and so forth. But let's return to our initial question, because I think this is absolutely fundamental. Why are some drugs illegal? And maybe we can offer a tentative answer, and perhaps also a speculative answer. So one way to explain the criminalization of some drugs is through the notion of autonomy. Well, the idea of individual autonomy is absolutely central to liberal, democratic, and capitalist societies. So what is autonomy? It's basically the capacity to govern yourself, to control and regulate your own affairs. Yet this can never occur in a social vacuum. So you're not supposed to regulate your own affairs just as you see fit. It's all about responsible self-governance. So responsible is the operating term here. And what is seen as responsible self-governance is, of course, open to interpretation and thus also to socio-historical change. Yet the idea of responsible self-governance does itself already indicate a major, an absolutely major socio-historical change. And I know that I'm running a bit of a risk here, in fact a double risk, because on the one hand I'm afraid of digressing too much from the original subject of our talk, and on the other hand I'm really sort of butchering very complex socio-historical processes here. But let's just say, okay, it does not make any sense to speak of feudal self-governance. Obviously, because the vast majority of feudal subjects were not supposed to govern themselves. They were ruled by the lord of a manor, by the king, and by the church, by overlapping and intersecting authorities, in fact. So the idea of individual autonomy, self-governance that is, could only emerge after the breakdown of feudalism. And feudalism was a system of both economic exploitation and political domination. And with the breakdown of feudalism, that double system of rule broke apart. On the economic side, there slowly but steadily arose a system of wage labor, and what Karl Marx famously called the double freedom of the working class. That is the freedom to freely sell their labor power, but also the freedom to starve to death. And on the political side, there arose all the well-known liberal ideas of the social contract, the rule of law, democracy, and so on and so forth. So in short, ideas of individual and collective self-governance. So for liberal, democratic, and capitalist societies, the idea of autonomy is absolutely central, both in the economic sphere and in the political sphere. Because a lot of that is down to the whole idea of contract, of parties that are equal parties to a contract, people that enter a contract of their their own free choice and so on and so forth. So, but mind you, this sort of, form of self-governance, and I think I've already indicated it, has always been highly qualified. It's still a form of autonomy that ultimately depends on quite a bit of domination and coercion. So, because when we speak of responsible self-governance, it's always self-governance according to dominant social values. And then here we see the whole catalogue of bourgeois values and already catch a glimpse of why drugs came to be construed as a threat to these values. And that's also to the very idea of autonomy. And these bourgeois values, and they're all pretty well known, have always cut across the economic, the political, and the moral. So we have ideas of productivity, prudence, moderation, thrift, entrepreneurialism, and so on and so forth. Of course, these values have also changed quite a bit. Well, these days, entrepreneurialism is much more important than it was in the 19th century. These days, we're all supposed to be entrepreneurs of ourselves, to constantly develop our human capital. Whereas thrift and moderation are perhaps a bit less important, especially at a time when consumption has become a civic duty. Yet again, not just any kind of consumption. It needs to be responsible consumption, so organic, fair trade, whatever that means, and gluten-free. Okay. Anyway, from the onset of industrialization, and industrialization relied on the availability and, above all, the pliability of wage labor. Drugs came to be construed as a social problem. This kind of, started with a kind of concern over gin houses in England, and so on and so forth. So, as a social problem, as a threat to both working class productivity on the one hand, and pliability, and also as a threat to morality. And this sort of, led to numerous campaigns against drug use and abuse, as well as all sorts of campaigns for the amelioration of other social problems. Interestingly enough, the 19th century is the time when the whole idea of the social and society emerged in the first place. Hence also the time when my discipline, sociology, emerged. But these campaigns were predominantly moral ones. They were about morality more than about anything else. And what sort of really structured these campaigns and the attempts to kind of, deal with these social problems was a supposed boundary between autonomy and productivity on the one hand, and irresponsibility, pleasure-seeking, and ultimately addiction on the other. And what is interesting, and what always kind of strikes me, and I'm not a film expert, what always strikes me is that the way drugs are being talked about and represented in film and TV is still informed by this very Victorian moral register. A register that centers on the loss of control, bodily ejection, we kind of get to that, debauchery, hedonism, etc. And the irony is that this does not only hold for blatant anti-drug propaganda films, but also for cultural products that seek to portray drug use in a more neutral or even positive light. But let's take another look at the idea of autonomy. Okay, so in order to act autonomously, we have to be in control over a clearly demarcated domain, which is our body. To act autonomously, to govern yourself, both in an individual and in a collective sense, means that individual autonomous actors have control of their bodies. So the idea of autonomy relies on a clear line between an inside and an outside. And this is where drugs come in, because drugs are then construed as a foreign agent crossing these lines. And if you do not properly police the boundaries of your body, you lose control over that domain that you ultimately require to be autonomous, namely your body. So if you remember the initial sort of brief discussion of the kind of reductionism in the way we talk about drugs, sort of reducing them to their pharmacological properties, you will see that why and how some drugs are construed as more dangerous than others. Not every foreign agent is equally dangerous, that is. Some may enter, others must definitely not enter. So you are allowed to put certain substances in your body, but not others. So you are yourself supposed to police the borders of your own body. But this is also done for you and to you, all to prevent the ultimate loss of your capacity for responsible self-governance. And the irony is that the policing of bodily borders also entails the violation of these borders. So bodies are open up to external surveillance and control, all in the name of protecting their autonomy. Just think of mandatory drug testing, cavity searches. These are all kind of blatant violations of bodily integrity. Again, in the name of kind of, protecting you from ultimately losing control over your body and hence ceasing to be a autonomous subject. So, and again, this is where inevitably where race and class come in, because some bodies are subject to more extensive external policing than others. External drug policing is, above all, both product and producer of oppressive class and race relations. But this is a different story. So, both the drawing of boundaries between and around bodies and the opening up of certain bodies to surveillance and external control hinge on an idea of autonomy, or rather a problematization of autonomy, both in an individual and in a collective sense. And this is also what we find in drug films. A constant problematization of autonomy. And the portrayal of drugs as at least a risk to individual autonomy. So as I said, I'm not a film expert, but I dare say that ultimately all drug films are about autonomy and or the loss of autonomy through foreign agents. Even those films that are not blatant anti-drug propaganda are ultimately caught up in this logic. So films such as Trainspotting or Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas are about autonomy, even if they sort of, somehow also try to celebrate the ultimate assertion of autonomy, namely the conscious decision to lose control. So, there's this very famous scene from Trainspotting which illustrates this very well indeed. Namely the toilet scene. We just have a short look at that now.
What the fuck are these? Under the normal run of things, I would have nothing to do with a cunt, but this was not the normal run of things.
Opium suppositories? Ideal for your purposes. Slow release. Bring you down gradually. Custom fucking designed for your needs.
I want a fucking hit!
So I've got me, eh? Take it or leave it. feeling better now, though, eh?
Oh, aye, for all the good they've done me, I might as well have stuck them up my arse. Heroin makes you constipated. The heroin from my last hit is fading away and the suppositories have yet to melt. I'm no longer constipated.
The fellow comes into it and jumps it again a little bit out to the right. Then comes someone that it's going to
I
be all right.
fantasize about a massive, pristine convenience. Brilliant gold taps, virginal white marble, a seat carved from ebony, a cistern full of Chanel No. 5, and a flunky handing me pieces of raw silk toilet roll. But under the circumstances, I'll settle for anywhere. And now I'm ready.
Okay. Well, this sort of, clip, you probably noticed the contrast between the voiceover and the pictures. The voiceover when he walks into this pub and he kind of talks about all the sort of, fancy toilet that he expects. So that kind of, voiceover was all about civilized way to go about things, to go about defecating, as it were. And then the kind of, the visual material, you see the complete loss of control, which kind of, starts way earlier with this leaky body. The body of a kind of drug user is frequently sort of portrayed as leaky, as not having a kind of clear boundaries, not having a clear border. And then the sort of, resultant kind of breakdown, a complete breakdown of civilization when he dives into, literally, human shit.
That's shit is my cue, okay? Shit is when I enter the scene. So, and what you just saw, that brings us to the second part, which we entitled, and again very tentatively, Objection and Genre in the Drug Film. And of course, ideally, it will it will kind of indicate what Marcus outlined already, and apply that to some of the, I guess, more prominent examples of drug film genres, and maybe some that are lesser so, or may not even be considered drug films per se. Just judging by your reaction, I mean, I was sitting facing you. You just witnessed abjection. I mean, that is the very. I mean, the way you reacted, the cringing part of you, the way you felt terrified and kind of horrified by this scene, right? By the swimming and sinking into human feces. That is what abjection does. That's the effect. What it means is, it is that part of the body that is not part of the body anymore, but that makes kind of our being in the body visible, right? And that's a term that we might not necessarily want to buy into. It's you know, has a long kind of heritage from psychoanalytical theory, but let's just assume that this is what these movies also interrogate. So feces are, you know, one primary example of something that doesn't belong to our body anymore, but reminds us of kind of the very, you know, the very kind of our very bodily entrapment and the kind of nasty and gross and horrible things it is able to produce, right? And I will not bore you with that anymore, but it is related to of course the question of autonomy, because it occupies specifically that space between the self and the outside world, right? It's that becomes other, but was once us. Projection, or the physically weird, indeed, through the insertion of substances, then I think mark one of the pivotal elements of a more humorous and comedic approach of fictional films on drugs. And I'm not talking about those decisive anti-drug propaganda movies here. Here then, I think I want to raise the question of genre, and specifically those genres that we might not typically consider to be drug film genres necessarily, or that have, for example, not necessarily been included in the program of the Symposium. After all, there might be something funny inherent in the obsession with autonomy and subjectivity, and the very breakdown, sometimes the vehement breakdown, right, which reaches witness of an autonomous subject or functionally autonomous body. Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas might be one example of that. While the entire genre of the stoner comedy can be said to frequently capture issues revolving around the autonomy of the self, both in body and psyche. Just consider the ultimate cliché of the stoner comedy, the slow, stupid, and lazy slacker. He, it's usually a male protagonist, right, is typically inhibited both physically and mentally, which often becomes brutally obvious in scenes when heightened awareness, again, both physically and mentally, would come in handy. Specifically, fighting scenes, fleeing scenes, right, car chases, and the like. And for some examples of you know, and again, you know, that's the beauty in being invited to give this talk. Some things where I think the kind of idea of abjection, and I'm stretching the term here, re-emerges, you know, where the kind of boundary between the self and the other is renegotiated, and then, but it becomes funny, are these three examples, and I think most of you recognize the still frames, right? This is probably the most prominent example, right? It's the dude, and it's actually, you know, the Big Lebowski, which might not be a stoner comedy per se, or not only a stoner comedy, but this is the second scene when we've just met him, right? And he buys milk, writing a check, and then he walks home, and there are a couple of thugs waiting for him, and they, you know, shove him down the toilet, and again, you know, the milk, it's kind of a nasty scene. The way he handles it, we know there's something funny about the dude, but certainly, you know, that's the toilet toppers that re-emerges, and then remember they pee on the rock, which then kind of triggers the whole narrative, right? Speaking of abjection, the second one is. This one is top left is Pineapple Express, right? Probably one of the more prominent stoner comedies in recent years. And here the character, the drug dealer, I mean, quintessential stereotype, cliche of a stoner, in a situation where he's being chased along with another protagonist by the mob, I guess, or at least thugs, he decides to spontaneously react and jumps into the dumpster. And then, I don't know if you remember that scene, he's in the dumpster and asks his companion to also jump in the dumpster because he considers this the best place to be. And then he asks him why, because he's in the dumpster already. And of course the dumpster is objection. And then this is a little more complicated scene. I think, Dude, Where's My Car, right? The famous scene, and I don't know if you how present it is. I was surprised at how long it lasts, right? The turning around, and of course the premise is a typical kind of stoner premise that they had an outrageous night, and then they walk out the front door and realize, dude, where's my car? The car's gone, and it kind of, the whole movie revolves around them finding out what happened the night before. And halfway through, as an audience, and apparently they themselves find out that they also got tattoos the night before, and basically tattoos of their two favorite words. And so and it kind of, and you know the kind of dialogue that ensues, right? What is on my back, sweet? What is on my back, dude? What is on my back, sweet? And it's always unclear. And of course, objection might be complicated here, but there is something to be said about, of course, the horror of getting tattooed and having that on your body, and then of course also about the misreading or the possible misreading of them, that this might just be a kind of a breakdown of communication in that sense when they talk about the tattoos. So much like Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, then these movies perform, I think, oftentimes their own openness. In the sense that I think, and that's the important part here, they remain ambiguous as to whether they laud and applaud the slacker, right? Specifically because of typically his or her potential to interrogate the kind of liberal capitalist obsession with autonomous subjects that Marcus just talked about, or whether or not these movies approach these characters more critically. And I think, and I would be very happy to talk to you guys about examples, because we're hoping for some feedback in the Q&A here after this, whether or not you find that true, or whether or not you think these movies actually kind of code a specific message about whether or not they affirmative of drug abuse, at least to some degree, or whether or not they open up this, a more problematic reading of it. But I think the important part is really that in this instance, in this kind of problematization already, we find something funny. And so whether or not, at the end of the day, we as an audience feel strongly reminded not to smoke too much weed, to make sure that we don't lose our car. These movies, I think, strongly suggest that there's also something good to be found in that. And that, I think, is key. And that already, I think, problematizes a more kind of clean-cut reading of this entrepreneurial self that's always in line, always efficient, always productive, and always autonomous in a way. And I think one indicator is that these characters, the main protagonists, typically they come out on top. This might not be true for all of the movies, but it's certainly true for The Big Lebowski, right? The dude, I mean, he basically starts in the toilet, and then we know where he is at the end. I mean, he's kind of procreated himself and found at least a weirdly romantic companion. And certainly got his rug back and something else, right? So they do sometimes come out on top. One of the movies that was actually shown, Easy Rider, and it's one of those instances where the main characters, the protagonists, even though they're drug users, don't come out on top. And I want to suggest here to read Easy Rider as an engagement and a critical kind of interrogation of the Western film genre. And I think one pivotal, and this happens, I think, on all kinds of levels, but importantly so, it also happens through drug use and abuse, right? So, I don't know how many of you know the film. I assume that most of you have seen it. We're not, I think Easy Rider obviously, engages the Western film genre, the typical aesthetics, the typical narratives, and the typical visions of the genre, that the Western actually plays in the American imaginary. And by American imaginary, I mean how American culture looks at itself. right? And movies obviously always do that. I mean, at least American movies. It might be different for Trainspotting, but these American movies, especially, I think here, these movies from the 1960s, when they talk about drugs, they also specifically talk about drugs in the United States, typically at the time of the production of the movie. Not a Western, it's better probably considered an Eastern, right? And that already indicates that, yes, they kind of interrogate that genre, but they also play with that. And I think the frequent encounters along the way, again, I hope you know that, specifically the ones that turn violent, powerfully, I think, re-examine and question the truly liberal, or better, a freer vision of what America might look like. And one thing that the movie makes clear, I think, is that the seemingly stranger the encounter, or the people encounter, the more they embody a true sense of what the movie, I think, considers Americanness. And I think already in the protagonist, the two embody that, right? They're called Billy and Wired, and sorry for the quality of the screenshots, it's an older movie, but of course, you know, Billy the Kid and Wyatt Earp immediately come to mind. One is always dressed in the Western attire, right? This is a real kind of in-your-face, you're watching a Western, they're riding these horses. But then also, right, you do have the paraphernalia, the American flag, the Star-Spangled Banner. So I think there's a good reason why we could call this movie a movie about America and American society, status quo 1968. I think here the interesting thing is that they die in the end. So if I read these other movies as, you know, the stoners coming out on top, what does one make of this ending? And how does one, is this, I mean, it's not related to drug use and abuse, but still, what does one make of the fact that these characters die towards the end? And I think there's something to be said about the sheer arbitrariness, the kind of the trigger happiness, and the fatality of their last encounter. Which makes them, I think, the true heroes here of this new kind of American landscape and this new American project, which comes, at least in the movie, with its own and different notion of an autonomous subject. One thoroughly grounded in the belief that autonomy, and Marcus mentioned that before, at its very core has to be repeatedly performed, reclaimed, and experienced by the autonomous subject itself. And that might even entail the possibility of that resulting in the end of autonomy. And so that is kind of the conundrum, and I think the vicious cycle, or the kind of cyclical nature of autonomy as a concept. Finally, one final genre, when we speak about genre, and I did bring still frames, for I think the question of the autonomous subject and its intersection with drugs serves as a meaningful backdrop, is the specific branch of the social problem film we typically call New Black Cinema, or more polemically, the hood film. And here then, much of what is cinematically explicated in most of the movies, and I'm referring here, this is also from the 1990s, Joshua said those were the easiest ones to get copyright for. You know, New Jack City, Boys in the Hood, Menace to Society, and I don't know how familiar you are with those films, but I think much of what is cinematically and in the narrative explicated or takes place is implicitly, sometimes explicitly related to drug, and it's a drug economy, and a specific drug economy that actually makes the neighborhood, right? And I think these films, these dramas, they are decisively, you know, kind of film or shed light on this underground economy that is dependent on creating some dependencies, you know, through drug dissemination and drug use and abuse, while doing away with others. And by that I refer to the US American welfare state, and specifically the failing welfare state, right? That has nothing in store really for many African Americans and Mexican Americans that live in the cities. What is more than, I think frequently these movies on the levels of emplotment establish two meaningful complexities when it comes to drugs and autonomy. Firstly, they scrutinize the effects of an ongoing and multifaceted and institutionalized effort to control or subdue or probably even erase the predominantly black and brown populations of the US American inner cities through the deployment of police strategies specifically related to the aforementioned war on drugs, and secondly, they more often than not liken the very basis of this underground economy that makes the hood to the broader context of capitalist production in the neoliberal age, and specifically this US-American kind of branch of capitalism that's thoroughly dog-eat-dog and without any kind of social control and welfare system. That's that. That's all we have for input.
Yeah. If you guys got any questions for us, I do hope so.
And then,
thanks for the talks. I was wondering, what do you guys make of the ending of the film Trainspotting? Because I saw it the other day here on Sunday again, and it felt to me, just giving my short insight, like I feel like the ending of the film suggests that, well, drug use and abuse obviously in this film can lead to all kinds of horrible things, but stopping and getting off of the drugs doesn't necessarily lead to any better life, because he's going to be a more acceptable kind of consumer, actually, buying all these things and TV and whatever, leading a life that is more acceptable but not necessarily better in this regard. So I was thinking,
yeah, that's very interesting, because what is often seen as a way out is a kind of either return to or arrival at the domestic. So you kind of, you stop doing drugs, you find a steady partner, you settle down, you raise a family, and that's it. So the domestic sphere is often sort of portrayed as this sort of escape route, as it were. However, it's not necessarily more fulfilling. It brings its own frustrations. And I think Trainspotting sort of plays with that and does so pretty well, because there's this one character who starts doing drugs when his girlfriend breaks up with him after the kind of scene when they picked the wrong video. And then he's the worst off towards the end. So there's always that tension between, on the one hand, a well-ordered or seemingly more or less well-ordered domestic sphere and the sphere of drug use and abuse. And this sort of, harks back to the 19th century. Right from the beginning, the domestic and domesticity was a way to, particularly domesticate the working classes, bring them into the fold and into well-ordered, well-mannered society.
Yeah, probably I go with the openness again. That would be my argument for most of the drug films. I think because drugs as a topic is such a contested and heated issue, I think these movies, unless there are these anti-drug propaganda films that take a very decisive stance, I think would be open to interpretation, and then be decisively ambiguous when it comes to reading one message and preferring a sober life that's well ordered but also potentially highly boring, right? Vis-a-vis the kind of spectacular life that we witness. And of course, let's face facts. What these movies do, they are movies. So one of the typical, plot devices of any fictional artifact is that they spectacularize certain states, I guess, and certain conflicts even, right? Just much like action movies exaggerate, conflicts to the degree that, there's always 100,000 bullets per movie, which is, a spectacularization of these kinds of physical engagement. And I think you witness are right? And I think there could be an argument, that could be made about how Trainspotting manages to have the audience take part, I guess, in the ups and downs, in the absurdities and complexities that come with drug use and abuse. And then potentially, as an audience member towards the end of the movie, you feel like, oh, this is the boring life. But quite possibly, and very quite possibly, you actually return to that very life as you walk home. And I think that's the very kind of ambiguity that successful movies typically hold, because they're open for interpretation, and some people will read it as it's pro-drug, and remember that scene, and I know that how stoners, some people that I know that smoke weed, right, talk about that movie and are fascinated by it and infatuated with it, and never mind the kind of critical undertones. Yeah.
Anybody else?
Well, I wonder in how far these kind of movies are kind of pushed into a more like exotic sphere of movies, and what this really means for like a larger picture of a drug discourse in society, because it kind of even seems to me more like even a fetish with this exotic and different and weird and absurd that never really happens to us. And I think what you just said is then suddenly there is the domestic sphere. I think this kind of goes along with it. What do you make of this?
Well, the thing is that they do sensationalize, there's no doubt about it. But then the overall public debate on drugs is sensationalist. If you kind of read stories about drug use in the papers, even quality papers, chances are that these are sensational stories about debauchery, about a drug scene, about something that is out there somewhere. Whereas, of course, it's well known that most drug use happens in a very mundane setting. And most drug use actually happens within the domestic sphere. We don't know anything about it, it's just mundane, it's everyday. But the everyday is just not very exciting. At the end of the day, you want to get viewers hooked, you want to entertain, and hence the sensationalization. And that kind of, the contrast that is sort of, built up between the drug scene on the one hand and the domestic sphere on the other. Whereas, of course, in actuality, as it were, that difference does not really hold.
I agree. I don't know if I have a good response or answer, but one thing that came to my mind, and that might be an apropos to what you said, is that I don't think it's a coincidence that one movie genre that we tend to forget when we talk about these drug films, specifically with drug films, because again they only serve as backdrop, are these major gangster films, and Prohibition era type gangster films that then extend into the 20th century, and I think that already, it's kind of a vehement contribution to I think again, to the discourse on the war on drugs. I don't know if it's pro or if it's anti. That's, I think, always hard to find out. But it's certainly on the spectacular side of things, and it immediately ties that even the mundane use typically to the spectacular realm of these outrageous crime networks that operate globally and are often talked about akin to terrorist networks and whatnot. And I think there's a good reason why, specifically in recent TV history, you would have a lot of the TV shows that focus on drug manufacturing or drug distribution that have become powerfully successful. If you think Narcos, Breaking Bad, and Breaking Bad I think is the most obvious example. And partly I think because it made that connection between the mundane domestic sphere and the working class or whatever crisis of the now, I guess, and how that might, again in the fictional realm be related to the broader complexity of drug use and distribution. Walter White, it's kind of become a cultural icon. It's interesting, yeah. Thanks. I'm lounging. I could do this all day. There is soccer though. Oh, there are questions.
Yeah, hi. So first of all, thank you for the talk. It was really insightful and interesting. My question is, I don't know it's a valid question, but what I noticed when I saw the trailer for Heaven Knows What, first of all, that was kind of provoking. And I'm wondering to what extent are these films made to provoke some sort of interest or disgust, and how are they managing these feelings in the person who sees them? Because it really is hard to stop looking at it, and you kind of feel disgusted, but at the same time you can't stop looking at it.
That's the car crash.
And is it made, for what reason and to what extent is that? So,
Well, that's a tricky question, because again, I would sort of, go along with what Martin said about the ambiguity, and also the kind of course, every film tries to produce effects in its viewers, but even the kind of, the effects produced are ambiguous, and not everybody has the same sort of effects when watching it. But then, of course, there is, especially through kind of, visuals and sound in particular, a strong attempt to produce particular emotions in people, be that shock, disgust, or even sympathy. The interesting thing about some of the films that were part of the program for the symposium was that there were also attempts to produce sympathy for addicts, and that was something that only sort of came up in the 1970s, when addicts were slowly but steadily kind of turned into objects of sympathy more than just kind of pure disgust and what have you. But the emotional response, I think, varies. I mean, again, as with the identification with a protagonist, or the non-identification with a protagonist, with the stoner comedy, it's quite obvious. Either you think, oh, well, he's just an idiot and he had it coming. You see what happens, or in Fear and Loathing, you see what happens if you do drugs. All sorts of, stuff happens to you. Or you kind of, identify with that. So, oh, well, perhaps I've been on a bad trip myself, and, it hasn't been that nice. Oh, poor guy. But I think sympathy or just kind of, pure disgust is something that is always somehow negotiated, and it's open to various responses on the emotional level too.
I would say yes to that, but absolutely to that. I think emotionally, yes, we never know what happens, but they are smart people, and specifically when it comes to marketing, producing, and disseminating these movies, and they're very self-aware. I mean, that's I think one of the important things to know about movies when you analyze them, that they're very self-aware of themselves as being movies that perform a certain function, and not just for entertainment purposes, but for broader discourses. And I think, the calculated spectacle, the calculated, outrage as a discursive response is a crucial marketing tool, or at least has become so. And I wouldn't be able to historically point you to a year or a decade when that happens, but I think at this stage it's very self-evident, or very evident that that's a powerful marketing tool, and specifically when it comes to, I think, movies that center on or revolve around drug use. The thing that comes to mind, and I don't know, again, I'm super bad with names, the guy who's RDG and Borat, right? His most recent film is apparently so outrageous that one of the marketing tools he used was when he did the whole night talk show circuit, he wasn't allowed to show clips apparently in the US because it was so outrageous. And that already, of course, is a marketing tool. And what they did instead is they screened the movie for a showcased audience that they then filmed for the home viewer watching the late night show. And you see them react in this outrageous manner by the movie, towards the movie. And so I think here you can actually tell that this is a very kind of calculated marketing tool, that discursively that's exactly what you want to produce, right? That people talk about you. Because any kind of communication that follows your movie in response to your movie, at least nowadays, is good communication. I think, and I might be oversimplifying, but there is a tendency.
Yeah.
Now, you started talking a bit about it concerning Breaking Bad, but I was wondering what kind of portrayal of drug use would you like to see?
Yeah, what would I like to see?
Yeah.
I don't mind.
After this, I mean, it's been a very interesting critique, but maybe some sort of.
No, I think I don't hold the, you know, I don't have beef or whatever. I'm not beefing with these movies. I actually like the movies, and I think there's quite a spectrum, quite a portfolio of portrays, and there are certainly some that I you know feel passionate about or that were meaningful to me, I guess, at a certain stage, and some still are. I mean, I love The Big Lebowski. I really am a big fan of the movie, and I think, you know, the kind of cultural work that Easy Rider performed cannot be, you know, it cannot be overstated. It's an unbelievable movie for the time. And I don't know if how familiar you are, but that acid scene on the New Orleans graveyard, I mean, it's you know, that's an aesthetic accomplishment. I think there is I think the movies run the same. You know, they always run the same risk that we run when we, you know, either use drugs or think about drugs or talk about drugs, because I think there's something to be said, you know, affirmatively to be said about drugs, but I mean, I know enough people, you know, to whom drugs were also dangerous, like in a very real and meaningful way, and so I think the ambiguity is well taken. And so if these movies are undecided about their stance on drugs, I'm all for it. And do I like stoner comedies? Hell yeah, they're funny. But you know, it's not the movie I want to watch every night, and I don't think it does justice to the complexity of what drugs are. But no, I'm not critiquing these. I just think they're kind of self-consciously open, and that's for the better. I think that's for the better. And all the movies I showed, I think I like them. You know, I like drug films. I'm at the right to the Symposium.
Yeah, again, not meant to pass any judgment, but Martin is absolutely right that the openness of, especially kind of, you know, films such as Trainspotting, is definitely important. But nonetheless, so kind of trying to get at, without sort of, you know, just dissing these films, is to show that they're still kind of, you know, part of a larger continuity. And it is really difficult for us to kind of, you know, break out of that sort of moral framework when talking about drugs. It's something, whenever drugs are being talked about, morals are not far behind. And I think this kind of, you know, creates more problems than it solves. And again, what kind of portrayal of drugs would I want to... I think, although I absolutely agree, I like all these films, and maybe we kind of obsess too much over it. Maybe kind of drugs are being talked about too much, and maybe that's part of the problem. I mean, people are going to do them anyway, no matter whether we talk about them or not. And yeah, for good or for ill, again, drug use carries risks, but it can also be great fun. But I think sort of, you know, just to get an idea that most drug use is actually quite harmless. And this is something that the kind of the sensationalism that we find in a lot of these films does not really do justice to. Because it sort of, you know, it sensationalizes and doesn't show the kind of, you know, full spectrum of drug use. Which is quite interesting because even demon drugs can be kind of, you know, used in a pretty sort of, you know, stable and safe environment. There was a 1990s study done by the United Nations on cocaine use, pretty much across the world, 30 or 40 different countries. And what they found was so unspectacular, it was unbelievable. It was so unspectacular that the United States government decided to suppress the report because it wouldn't fit into the whole kind of, you know, policies that they had.
Then no one made a movie about it.
In terms of war on drugs. So there's this whole other side that we kind of, you know, go home after a day in the office and we kind of, you know, pop open a bottle or skin up and pretty sure that the vast majority in this room does that. Well, I for one do. So
that is the vast majority.
No, but anyway, I think that's part of the sensationalism is part of the problem, I think.
And then of course we talk about that in the seminar to bore you, but what is a drug anyway, right? 9 drug of choice is, sugar in high doses, and that's of course a psychoactive substance, and it's never been illegal, but some other stuff is. And it's called Coca-Cola for a reason. Right? Was there Coca-Cola?
Yes. That was that. But then again, don't get me wrong, drug use does carry risks.
Wow, that was good.
So I want that on the record. Okay?
That's on camera. Famous last sentence.
Yeah.
Love it. Sounds like a final statement to me, actually. Pretty.
Okay. There are no more urgent questions that you guys have. Just kind of call it a day. Oh yeah.
Yeah, I have one more question. Sorry. I was wondering, how does this movies about drugs, how do they, because you said something about sympathy, about the attitude towards drug users, so to say. And what I've seen and what I've heard the most from my friends, from people who watch these movies, is basically whether they kind of associate themselves with the person, with the protagonist, with the drug user, but does it somehow affect how people look at drug users? I've just read this book about drug on wars, war on drugs, and does it help somehow to change this view, to change this perspective that drug use is so bad and these people are totally, completely lost and just basically they're treated like criminals in many countries? Does it somehow affect this?
I do have my doubts about that. I don't know. It's hard to kind of come up with an answer to that, but I do have my doubts about it. Because even if we somehow identify with a drug addict on screen, it does not mean that we would identify with drug addicts in our neighborhoods. Once sort of, NIMBYism kicks in, you don't want it in your backyard. You might have a very kind of, liberal stance on drugs, but you do not want drug addicts in your immediate neighborhoods. And I think this applies to everybody, to some extent at least. That, seeing it on the screen and sympathizing with something that happens on the screen does have effects, no doubt about it. But I think at the end of the day, people respond much more strongly to what happens within their immediate environment. So for instance, if you have drug dealers in your backyard, you have an opinion on that. And I'm pretty sure that it won't be a totally positive one. If you kind of find needles in your backyard, used needles, you have an opinion on that, and definitely not a positive one. And probably not one that the first association, if you find needles in your backyard, will probably not be to sympathize with the poor addicts, even though you might have done so kind of watching a drug film on the screen.
That's it.
Okay.
Thank you.